The hum of the servers was the only sound in the dimly lit room. Dr. Ethan Caldwell's eyes were bloodshot, glued to the screen in front of him. It was late, and he was the last one in the lab, a familiar routine for a man who had spent more years than he cared to admit, sifting through endless streams of lunar data. Yet, something felt different tonight. There was a tension in the air, a stillness that gnawed at the back of his mind. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, and considered calling it a night. But just as he reached to shut down the terminal, his screen flickered, and a new batch of images loaded, streaming in from one of the deep space satellites that orbited the moon. It should have been more of the same: cratered terrain, vast plains of dust, and the occasional jagged cliffside. Instead, he saw it, a dark, rectangular shape, half buried in the shadow of a crater's edge. He squinted, leaning in closer, certain it was a glitch, maybe a shadow or a trick of the light. But the shape was too precise, too unnatural. With a few quick keystrokes, he enhanced the image, bringing the anomaly into sharper focus. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. It was a door, massive, flat, and smooth, cutting through the jagged, uneven surface of the moon as if it had been there all along, waiting to be discovered. Ethan's mind raced as he analyzed the details. There were no visible seams, no handles or mechanisms, just a solid black structure that stood in stark contrast to the pale gray of the lunar dust. It was the kind of discovery that made careers, but it was also the kind that raised questions. Questions no one at NASA would want to answer. What was it doing there? Who or what had put it there? Ethan knew he should report it immediately, but his hands hesitated over the keyboard. The official protocols flashed through his mind, all the red tape and layers of bureaucracy that would drown out the discovery before it ever saw the light of day. The door would be buried under classified files, and he'd be left with nothing but the memory of something he could never talk about. He printed the images, each one clearer and more disturbing than the last, and stuffed them into a folder. The walk to Dr. Hayes' office was long, each step heavy with a sense of dread he couldn't quite explain. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows along the narrow corridor. Ethan felt like he was walking into a void, each step echoing in the silence. Dr. Hayes was a man of few words, but as Ethan placed the folder on his desk, he noticed a flicker of curiosity in his usually stoic expression. Hayes opened the folder, flipping through the images without a word. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the soft rustle of paper. Then Hayes' eyes narrowed, and Ethan saw it, the briefest flash of fear, quickly masked by a forced neutrality. "What is this?" Hayes' voice was low, cautious. "It's from the latest lunar scans. I ran the diagnostics 3 times. It's not a glitch. It's a structure." Ethan tried to keep his voice steady, but he couldn't hide the tremor that crept in. "A door, buried on the moon's surface." Hayes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, staring at the images as if they might vanish if he blinked. For a long time, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "This doesn't leave this room. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded, but it was too late. The image was burned into his mind, the dark, impossible door that shouldn't exist, and yet there it was, challenging everything they thought they knew. He didn't sleep that night, replaying the discovery over and over in his head, trying to make sense of it. Somewhere, deep inside, a voice whispered to him, urging him to forget, to walk away. But he couldn't. Something had been awakened in him, a curiosity that bordered on obsession. The next morning, Ethan was called into a meeting. The room was crowded, filled with faces he recognized from the higher echelons of NASA. Engineers, scientists, people who rarely mingled with his level of operations. They all wore the same expression, a mix of excitement and unease. At the head of the table stood Dr. Hayes, his face unreadable. "We're sending a team," he announced without preamble. "A small covert operation. We've already cleared it. You'll be going up with them." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "You want me to—" "Yes," Hayes interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're the one who found it, so you're going to help figure out what it is. But let me be very clear, Caldwell. This mission is off the books. Whatever you find up there, you report directly to me. No one else." Ethan nodded, but the reality of it hadn't quite sunk in. He had spent years studying the moon, analyzing data from a distance, never once considering he might actually set foot on its surface. And now, not only was he going, but he was going to find something that had no right being there. The days leading up to the launch blurred together in a haze of preparation and briefings. The other members of the team were handpicked. Ramirez, a geologist with a penchant for uncovering the impossible. Liu, a seasoned astronaut with nerves of steel. And Fields, a technician who could make anything work, given enough duct tape and caffeine. They were an odd mix, but they shared the same unspoken understanding. This mission was different, and none of them would come back the same. The shuttle launch was smooth, the kind of perfection that made Ethan's skin crawl. As they approached the moon, the door came into view, a tiny black speck against the endless gray. It grew larger as they descended, looming over them, casting a shadow that felt out of place in the stark sunlight. The moment their boots hit the lunar surface, Ethan felt the weight of it, a suffocating pressure that had nothing to do with gravity. The door was closer now, more menacing, its smooth, dark surface absorbing all light, reflecting nothing. It was cold, unyielding, and it stood there, defiant against the barren wasteland, as if daring them to come closer. As they approached, Ramirez muttered something under his breath. Ethan didn't catch it, but he didn't need to. The fear was palpable, seeping into their suits, into their minds. Ethan raised a gloved hand, his fingers hovering just inches from the door. It felt wrong, like touching something ancient and forbidden. But the mission was clear. Open the door and report back. With a deep breath, he pressed his hand against the surface. The door responded instantly, sliding open with a soft, mechanical hiss, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The void inside felt like a mouth, waiting, silent and hungry. And as they stood there, staring into the abyss, Ethan felt a cold realization settle over him. They hadn't found the door. The door had found them. The silence on the moon was absolute, a suffocating emptiness that wrapped around the team as they stared into the black void behind the door. Ethan's breath was loud in his helmet, each inhale and exhale a reminder of how fragile they were, how small and vulnerable against the vast, unknown darkness. For a moment, no one moved, their gazes fixed on the abyss as if it might swallow them whole at any moment. "We proceed as planned," Liu said, her voice crackling over the comms. Her tone was steady, but there was a tension behind it, a forced calmness that made Ethan's skin crawl. "Ramirez, you take point. Caldwell, stay close. Fields, you're on comms." She was trying to maintain control, to remind them of their training. But they all knew this was different. There was no training for this. The light from their helmets cut through the dark, but only barely. As they stepped across the threshold, the temperature dropped, a cold that bit through their suits and settled deep into their bones. Ethan shivered, his breath misting against his visor, even though he knew it shouldn't be possible in the vacuum. It was as if the air itself had grown thick and heavy, pushing against them, resisting their every step. The corridor was long and narrow, its walls smooth and featureless, extending into the darkness without end. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the ground, a gritty, metallic noise that seemed to echo off the walls, amplifying the emptiness. The further they walked, the more Ethan felt it, an unseen presence watching them from the shadows, a silent gaze that followed their every move. "What the hell are these?" Ramirez muttered, breaking the silence. He had stopped, crouching down beside the wall, his gloved fingers hovering over strange markings etched into the surface. They were faint, almost invisible, but as Ethan looked closer, he could see them, twisted, jagged symbols that ran along the walls in a chaotic, swirling pattern. Ethan knelt beside Ramirez, tracing the lines with his eyes. The symbols were unlike anything he'd seen before, neither letters nor numbers, but something else entirely. Something ancient, alien. They seemed to pulse under the light, flickering in and out of focus, as if they were trying to shift, to rearrange themselves into something recognizable. For a moment, Ethan thought he could almost understand them, like a word on the tip of his tongue, just out of reach. "They're not in any known language," Fields said, her voice tense. She was monitoring the readings, her eyes flicking nervously across the screen. "I'm not picking up anything. No radiation, no electromagnetic signals. It's like they're not even there." But they were there. Ethan could feel them. A low, rhythmic vibration that hummed through the walls, through his suit, through his skin. It was a sound he couldn't quite hear, but it resonated deep in his chest, a slow, steady pulse that matched the beating of his heart. "Keep moving," Liu ordered, her voice tight. "We need to reach the end of this corridor." But as they pressed on, the walls began to change. The smooth surfaces gave way to jagged, uneven edges, and the symbols grew more erratic, more chaotic. They twisted and turned, overlapping and intertwining, forming patterns that made Ethan's head ache if he stared too long. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, but there was no turning back. Each step took them further from the surface, further from safety. And the deeper they went, the stronger the sense of unease grew. The air felt heavier, colder, and Ethan could hear whispers, faint and distant, like voices carried on a breeze that didn't exist. He tried to ignore them, but they grew louder, more insistent, until he couldn't tell if they were real or just in his head. "I'm hearing things," Ramirez said suddenly, his voice shaky. "Are you guys hearing things?" "No one's hearing anything," Liu snapped, but her voice was brittle, on the edge of cracking. "It's just the comms acting up. Stay focused." But Ethan knew she was lying. He could hear it too, the faint murmur of voices, a language he couldn't understand, whispering just at the edge of his awareness. It wasn't coming from the comms. It was coming from the walls, from the symbols, from the darkness itself. The corridor widened suddenly, opening up into a vast chamber that swallowed the light from their helmets. For a moment they stood at the edge, their lights flickering weakly, unable to penetrate the shadows that loomed before them. The air was still, suffocatingly quiet, and Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he stepped forward, his boots scraping against the cold metal floor. In the center of the chamber there was a light, faint and distant, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. It flickered, casting long, twisted shadows that crawled across the walls, writhing and shifting like living things. As they moved closer, Ethan realized the light was not a bulb or a lamp, but something else entirely. An orb suspended in midair, glowing softly with a sickly, pale green light. "What is that?" Fields whispered, her voice barely audible. No one answered. They were all staring at it, mesmerized, unable to look away. The light seemed to draw them in, pulling at their minds, their thoughts, until it was the only thing they could see. Ethan's vision blurred, his head swimming as the whispers grew louder, more urgent, filling the room with a soft, incessant murmur. He reached out, his hand trembling, as if some unseen force was guiding him. The moment his fingers brushed the surface of the orb, the chamber exploded with light, blinding him. The whispers surged, 1,000 voices overlapping, screaming in a language he could not understand. And then he saw it. Flashes of something vast, something ancient, an endless sea of eyes staring back at him from the darkness. Ethan stumbled back, gasping, but the images continued to flood his mind. Worlds crumbling into dust, stars winking out of existence, and through it all, a single terrible truth that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. The door wasn't a portal. It was a barrier that had been built to keep something out, or worse, to keep something in. "What did you see?" Lou demanded, shaking him, but Ethan couldn't find the words. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. The orb pulsed again, and this time the light was dimmer, almost as if it was breathing. "We need to go," Ramirez said, his voice frantic, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here, now." But the door was gone. Ethan turned, searching the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the smooth, endless walls stretching out in every direction. The entrance they had come through, the way back to the surface, had vanished, as if it had never been there at all. "Caldwell, report," Fields said, but her voice was distant, drowned out by the whispers that filled his head. Ethan stumbled, his vision blurring, as the symbols on the walls began to move, writhing and twisting, forming new patterns, new shapes. They were no longer random. They were words he could almost read, almost understand. And then, just for a moment, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the orb dimmed, and in the darkness, Ethan heard a voice, a single clear voice, speaking directly into his mind. "You are not alone." The light flared, and the chamber came alive, the walls rippling and shifting as if they were breathing. Ethan's head throbbed, and he stumbled forward, falling to his knees as the whispers returned, louder than before, a deafening chorus that echoed through the chamber. The team was scattered, their lights flickering, their comms filled with static. Ethan could barely make out their voices, panicked and broken, as the darkness closed in around them. But he knew one thing, a truth that cut through the chaos, sharp and clear. They had come here looking for answers, but all they had found was a question that no one should have ever asked. And somewhere, deep within the darkness, something had started to wake up. Ethan's mind was unraveling. Every breath felt like a desperate gasp in a vacuum, his lungs burning as if they were filling with something other than air. The chamber around them seemed to pulse, the walls rippling like the surface of a black ocean under a full moon. The orb's sickly green light continued to flicker, each pulse in time with the throbbing ache in his skull. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing, watching, waiting. "Liu, where's the exit?" Ramirez's voice cracked over the comms, barely masking his fear. "The way out. Where the hell did it go?" "There's no way out," Liu replied, her voice trembling, a rare crack in her usually steely demeanor. "There's nothing. Just keep it together. We're going to—" Her voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a harsh static that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He spun around, searching for her in the dim light, but the chamber seemed to stretch infinitely, each shadow deeper and more impenetrable than the last. They had been standing together only moments ago, but now she was gone, swallowed by the dark. "Liu?" Ethan called out, his voice echoing back to him, distorted and hollow. "Liu, respond." Nothing. Just the static, and then beneath it, something else, a low rhythmic hum, like the slow, deliberate beat of a drum. It resonated through the chamber, through his bones, a sound so deep he felt it more than heard it. Fields was fumbling with her equipment, trying to restore the comms, her hands shaking. I don't know what's happening," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "The frequencies are all over the place. It's like something's jamming us." Ethan wanted to reassure her, to tell her they could fix it, that they would find a way out, but the words died in his throat. He didn't believe it himself. He could feel the cold, creeping dread that had settled in his chest, a suffocating weight that made it hard to think, hard to breathe. And then, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, more coherent, as if the voices had grown stronger, closer. Ethan clutched his head, trying to block them out, but they seeped into his thoughts, worming their way through every crevice of his mind. He could almost understand them now, fragments of words and phrases swirling together, forming a language he had never heard but somehow recognized. "They found us. They shouldn't have come." It was not time. The orb pulsed again, brighter, and the room lit up, revealing what they had been too blinded by fear to see. The walls were not solid, they were translucent, and behind them, moving slowly, deliberately, were shadows, dozens, maybe hundreds, shifting and twisting, like figures swimming through dark water. Ethan's stomach turned as he realized they had been watching from the beginning, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for something. "Ethan," Fields whispered, and he turned to see her staring at the orb, her eyes wide with terror. "Look." The orb had changed. It no longer flickered but glowed steadily, a harsh, piercing light that cast long, thin shadows across the floor. And within it, something was moving, something that hadn't been there before. It was a shape, writhing and shifting, as if trying to emerge, trying to break free. "No," Ethan muttered, shaking his head. This isn't possible." But it was happening, right before his eyes. The shape within the orb stretched, elongating, until it became a hand that pressed against the surface, pushing outwards, the translucent membrane of the orb stretching and bulging, ready to tear. For a moment Ethan saw it clearly, every bone, every vein, outlined in stark relief, and then it shattered. The orb burst open, a wave of green light flooding the chamber, and the whispers became a roar, a deafening, chaotic cacophony that echoed off the walls. Ethan stumbled back, shielding his eyes, but he could still see it, the thing that had emerged, crawling out of the broken orb, its limbs long and spindly, its body twisted and misshapen, as if it had been trapped and contorted for eons, waiting for this moment. It was not human, not even close. Its skin was dark and mottled, covered in patterns that resembled the symbols on the walls, and its eyes were endless, black pits, deeper than any darkness Ethan had ever seen. It moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, like a marionette on invisible strings, its head twitching as it turned to look at them. Field screamed, a raw, primal sound that was cut short as the creature lashed out faster than Ethan could follow. She was lifted off the ground, her body convulsing, her limbs bending at impossible angles as if they were being twisted and pulled apart from the inside. Ethan tried to reach for her, to do something, anything, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by a fear that went beyond the physical. Ramirez was shouting, his voice barely audible over the roar, but Ethan couldn't make out the words. The creature's head snapped towards him, and Ramirez's voice was silenced, his body crumpling to the floor like a discarded puppet. Ethan could only watch, helpless, as the creature began to change, its form shifting and distorting, its limbs elongating and splitting, becoming something new, something worse. And then the whispers stopped. For a moment, the chamber was silent, the only sound the ragged, desperate gasps of Ethan's breath. The creature turned to him, and for the first time he saw its eyes clearly. Dark, empty voids that seemed to pull him in, drawing him closer, drowning him in their endless depths. It stepped forward, and Ethan felt a pressure in his chest, a weight that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. "We have been waiting," the creature said, but its voice was not a voice. It was a sensation, a thought pressed directly into his mind, bypassing his ears, his sanity. Waiting for so long. Ethan tried to speak, but no sound came out. The creature moved closer, its form flickering, shifting, as if it was struggling to maintain its shape. "They built the barriers to keep us from you, but you opened the door. You let us in." He understood then, in a way that went beyond logic, beyond reason. The door hadn't been a portal, it had been a seal, a lock on something that should never have been disturbed. And by opening it, they had broken that seal, released something that had been trapped for millennia, something that should never have been allowed to wake. The creature extended a hand, its long skeletal fingers reaching for him, and Ethan felt a cold, sharp pain as they brushed against his skin, like needles piercing through his suit, through his flesh. The pain spread, a burning, searing heat that coursed through his veins, and he realized with a sudden, terrible clarity that it wasn't trying to hurt him. It was trying to change him. He could feel it in his mind, pulling at his thoughts, twisting them, bending them to its will. Images flashed before his eyes, planets burning, stars collapsing, an endless void swallowing everything, and at the center of it all, a presence, ancient and vast, reaching out across the darkness. "You will be our voice," the creature said, and Ethan felt his consciousness slipping, dissolving, becoming part of something much larger, something that stretched across time and space, an endless, hungry void that consumed everything it touched. And as the last shreds of his awareness faded, he heard the whispers again, soft and clear, a single haunting phrase that echoed through the darkness. The door was not meant to be opened, but now that it has, there is no turning back. We will come through, and you will be our guide. The light dimmed, and the chamber began to fade, the shadows closing in around him. The creature's eyes glowed, brighter than ever, and for a moment Ethan saw the truth. An endless legion, waiting just beyond the veil, ready to pour through the breach they had created. And then everything went dark, and Ethan was gone, swallowed by the abyss, leaving only the whispers drifting through the empty, silent chamber, waiting for the next voice to answer the call. Ethan drifted in the dark, his senses dull and distant, like a faint echo of a memory. He was no longer aware of his body, only of a cold, oppressive weight pressing down on him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He tried to scream, but there was no sound, no air, just a suffocating silence that wrapped around him, tight and unyielding. He had lost track of time, seconds, minutes, hours. It all bled together, meaningless in the void. Then slowly a light appeared, dim and hazy at first, flickering like a dying star on the edge of his vision. It grew brighter, pulsing with a sickly, unnatural glow. And as it did, Ethan felt something stir within him, a faint, painful awareness that clawed its way back to the surface. He was no longer alone. The whispers had returned louder than before, a cacophony of voices overlapping, merging until they became one, a single, terrifying chorus that echoed through his mind. You will see. You will understand. The light sharpened and Ethan's vision cleared, revealing the chamber once more. But it was different now, vast and infinite, the walls stretching out into eternity, lined with the symbols he had seen before. They pulsed and shifted, rearranging themselves, forming patterns that twisted and spiraled in a way that defied logic, defied sanity. It was as if the chamber had expanded beyond the physical, become a gateway to something far greater, something that existed outside the boundaries of space and time. He tried to move, but his body was unresponsive, locked in place. He could feel his heart pounding, a frantic, irregular beat, and he realized with a jolt of fear that it wasn't just his own heartbeat. There were others, dozens of them, thrumming in unison, as if he were connected to something much larger, much darker. The whispers grew louder, and he could hear them clearly now, a voice that resonated deep within his chest, vibrating through his bones. Look, it commanded, and Ethan's eyes were drawn to the center of the chamber where the orb had been. In its place was a void, a gaping blackness that seemed to pull at the edges of reality, distorting everything around it. And from that void, something was emerging, something vast and incomprehensible, a shape that defied description, shifting and writhing like a mass of tendrils, its surface glistening and wet, reflecting the green light that pulsed from the walls. Ethan wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The sight was mesmerizing, horrifying, a twisted parody of life that made his mind reel. The tendrils stretched out, coiling and twisting, each one tipped with an eye, black and endless, staring at him, through him. And as he gazed into those eyes, he saw flashes of something, visions, images that burned themselves into his brain, impossible to erase. He saw Earth, fragile and alone, spinning silently in the cold void of space. He saw other worlds, countless and distant, each one marked by the same dark, terrible stain, a shadow that crept across their surfaces, consuming everything in its path. He saw people, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams as the shadows swallowed them whole, leaving nothing but emptiness. The tendrils moved closer, their movements slow and deliberate, and Ethan felt the weight of their gaze, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. He could feel them probing, searching, sifting through his thoughts, his memories, as if they were looking for something, some hidden truth buried deep within his mind. And then, with a sudden, blinding clarity, he understood. The door had never been a doorway. It had been a beacon, a signal that had reached out across the void, calling to something that had been waiting, trapped, for longer than he could comprehend. And by opening it, they had done more than just break a seal. They had sent out a message, a cry that echoed across the stars, summoning something from the darkness. "You have called to us," the voice whispered, and Ethan felt it echo through his mind, a cold, sharp pain that split his thoughts apart. "We were forgotten, but you have remembered. You have opened the way, and now we will come." The tendrils brushed against his skin, cold and slick, and Ethan shuddered, a wave of nausea washing over him. He could feel them burrowing into his mind, peeling back the layers of his consciousness, exposing everything he had ever been, ever known, until there was nothing left but a raw, empty core. And then, slowly, the tendrils began to weave, knitting themselves together, forming something new, something that pulsed and throbbed with a dark, terrible life. Ethan's vision blurred, and for a moment he was back on Earth, standing in the middle of a crowded street, surrounded by people who walked past him without a second glance. He could hear the distant hum of traffic, the murmur of voices, the familiar, comforting sounds of normalcy. But as he looked closer, he saw it. The shadows creeping along the edges of the buildings, slipping through the cracks in the pavement, spreading out like a stain. The people didn't see it, didn't notice as the shadows touched them, seeped into their skin, their eyes, their minds. "They are blind," the voice said, and Ethan's vision shifted, showing him 1,000 other worlds, 1,000 other lives, each one touched by the same darkness, the same creeping, insidious presence. "But you will make them see. You will be our harbinger, our voice." "No," Ethan whispered, the word barely audible, even to himself. "No, I won't." But the voice only laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down his spine. "You have already begun," it said, and Ethan realized with a growing horror that it was right. He could feel it, the darkness spreading through him, seeping into every part of his being, filling the empty spaces left behind. He had been changed, transformed, and there was no going back. The chamber began to warp, the walls folding in on themselves, collapsing into the void, and Ethan could see it now. The thing behind the door, the thing they had set free. It was vast, endless, a mass of eyes and tendrils and mouths, all shifting and undulating, stretching out across the darkness, reaching for him, for Earth, for everything. And he understood, finally, what it had been trying to say, what it had always been trying to say. We are many, we are endless, and now we are awake. The tendrils tightened around him, pulling him closer, and Ethan felt his consciousness fading, dissolving into the dark. He wanted to scream, to fight, but there was no strength left, no will, only the cold, empty certainty that this was how it was meant to end. As the last of his thoughts slipped away, he felt a new presence take shape, a voice that wasn't his own, but somehow was, speaking through him, with him, in a language that was older than time. "The way is open. We are coming." And with those final words, the chamber collapsed completely, folding into the void, leaving nothing but darkness behind. The whispers faded, the light dimmed, and in the vast, endless silence of the abyss, the presence stirred, reaching out across the stars, across the infinite, a single, unending thought echoing through the void. We are awake, we are coming, and there is nowhere left to hide. And somewhere, deep in the heart of space, the doors began to open one by one, each one a gateway, a promise, a warning. The message had been sent, the call had been answered, and now there was no turning back.